He once recalled his first meeting with James Brown, a reminder of an era when a black artist could not attempt anything big on television without someone, usually someone white, standing behind them. For years, Soul Train looked like the opposite of that reality, a sanctuary where black artists danced, laughed, and performed in front of millions of American families every weekend. But the cameras never showed the tension sitting just off stage, because Don Cornelius was not only the smooth host with the velvet voice. He was also a judge, a gatekeeper, and according to multiple people who stood behind those curtains, a man who carried a mental list. A list of names he would not forgive and live on air, moments he refused to forget. Each entry on that list began the same way, with an artist doing something unforgivable in front of a live audience, with no chance to edit, rewind, or hide. Artists who pushed their dancing into overt sexuality, who went off script, who kept performing long after the cutoff signal flashed, or who challenged Cornelius's authority where the entire country could see it. The punishment never appeared in public. There were no lectures, no official bans, no dramatic speeches to the crowd. Instead, after those broadcasts, something quieter happened. Invitations stopped arriving. Phone calls went unanswered. Careers that once moved effortlessly through Soul Train's doors suddenly found them locked. What looked like coincidence from the outside, insiders said, was actually control. And tonight we open that file. We examined the 7 Soul Train guests. Don Cornelius was believed to resent the most the exact on-air seconds that allegedly sealed their fate, and the hidden system of silence that punished black artists not for lacking talent, but for stepping out of line where America could not look away. 1. Rick James, the on-air defiance that turned Don Cornelius against him. The first artist widely believed to ignite Don Cornelius's long-term resentment was Rick James. The moment that defined their break unfolded in early 1981 inside the Soul Train studio in Los Angeles, at a time when black performers on American television were being watched more closely than ever. This was not a late-night program tucked away in the schedule. Soul Train aired in broad daylight. It reached living rooms, kitchens, and church-going families from one coast to the other. The show survived because Cornelius had carefully convinced networks and sponsors that black music could be thrilling without tipping into danger. Rick James, in Cornelius's eyes, was the embodiment of that danger. By March or April of 1981, Rick James was at the height of his infamy. Super Freak had exploded, and his persona was loud, unapologetically sexual, and intentionally confrontational. Booking him, according to crew members who were there, was controversial long before he ever stepped onto the stage. Insiders recalled that Don Cornelius was uneasy even before Rick arrived at the studio. When Rick James finally walked into rehearsal, dressed in an open leather outfit, heavy metal chains clinking against his chest, and an attitude that made it clear he had no intention of blending in, the room tightened. During rehearsal, Cornelius reportedly pulled Rick aside near the edge of the stage. This was not a casual suggestion. This was a directive. He told Rick to ease up on physical contact with the dancers, to tame the choreography, and to keep everything firmly within family-friendly boundaries. Rick James did not agree. Witnesses say he laughed, shook his head, and replied that funk was not meant to be polite. One dancer later remembered him saying, "If they want clean, they shouldn't have booked me." The conversation did not erupt into a screaming match, but it was sharp, uncomfortable, and impossible to misinterpret. Cornelius ended it with a clear warning: if Rick crossed the line when the cameras were live, there would be consequences. Rick James stepped over that line anyway. When the red light came on and the performance began, Rick walked onto the Soul Train stage, wearing exactly the same outfit Cornelius had objected to. From the very first seconds, he ignored the subtle signals from stage managers, those small gestures meant to nudge performers back into safe territory. As the dancers closed in around him, Rick moved closer to one of the women. He placed his hands on her waist and pulled her into him. Then came the moment that insiders say sealed everything. In front of the primary camera, Rick pressed his body against hers chest to chest, holding the contact long enough that nobody watching could possibly miss it. There was no time delay. No quick cut to the audience. The image traveled straight into American homes. Crew members in the control room later described pure panic. Directors searched for a backup angle that would avoid the shot, but there was no escape. Rick James repeated the behavior as the song went on, fully aware that he was still live. To many people at home, the performance looked electric, raw, unforgettable. To Don Cornelius, standing off to the side of the stage, it looked like a direct betrayal. The confrontation resumed the moment the performance ended. Multiple witnesses claimed Cornelius went straight for Rick backstage, no longer composed. This time his anger was visible. Cornelius accused him of ignoring clear instructions and humiliating the show in front of networks and sponsors who already doubted whether Soul Train was safe for daytime TV. Rick fired back. According to one longtime dancer, Rick told Cornelius that Soul Train was afraid of real black expression and that all the cleaning up was suffocating the culture. Another crew member remembered Rick throwing out a line that would echo for years: "You sell soul, then panic when it shows up." Voices rose. Movement stopped. Staff members froze in place as the two men clashed, one defending the order that kept the show alive, the other defending the chaos that powered his music. The argument ended not with an apology, but with a gesture that, according to veteran staff, meant everything. Cornelius walked away without another word. That walk, they said, was the signal. A decision had been made. Rick James was never publicly banned. No press release mentioned a fallout. But what happened afterward was obvious to anyone who followed the show. Invitations stopped. Special episodes and retrospectives moved forward without his name. Artists with fewer hits and far less cultural impact returned again and again, while Rick James faded from the Soul Train schedule, as if he had never been one of its most unforgettable guests. Rumors spread behind the scenes. Some people claimed network executives had called directly after the broadcast, furious about what had gone out during a family time slot. Others insisted Cornelius himself used Rick as a cautionary tale backstage, a living example of what happened when someone embarrassed the show in front of the entire country. Whatever the exact conversations were, one outcome was undeniable. Rick James kept his career and his controversy, but he lost access to the most powerful black music platform on American television. Years later, fans would look back at that performance and call it legendary. Clips would circulate as proof of Rick James's wild charisma. But inside the Soul Train studio in 1981, it was remembered differently, as the night Rick James openly defied Don Cornelius, challenged his authority on live TV, and became the first artist quietly erased from the show's future. James Brown, the night he took over Soul Train on live television. By late 1974, James Brown wasn't just an artist, he was an institution. Across America, he was known as the Godfather of Soul, a man whose name alone could change the temperature of a room. He carried the kind of authority very few black performers had at that time. When Soul Train booked him, it wasn't just another guest appearance. It was an event. But it was also a potential problem. Unlike the younger acts who still needed Soul Train to boost their visibility, James Brown believed something very different. He behaved like Soul Train needed him just as much as he needed it, if not more. The taping took place on the Soul Train stage in Los Angeles, during a period when Don Cornelius was tightening his grip on every aspect of the show. Soul Train by then ran like a command center. Every second was scheduled. Every transition was rehearsed. Every performance had a fixed start and a fixed end. Artists were expected to respect the clock, respect the cameras, and above all, respect the authority of the production team. James Brown respected none of that. According to multiple accounts from musicians and crew present that day, the tension was already noticeable during the pre-show briefing. Brown questioned the length of his performance slot, arguing that his music wasn't built to fit neatly inside a television time box. Soul isn't something you rush, he believed. Cornelius, calm but firm, reminded him that Soul Train was a national broadcast. They had breaks to hit sponsors to satisfy, and a schedule that could not be thrown away for any one artist, even James Brown. The exchange never turned into a full-blown argument, but several witnesses said it felt like watching two kings measuring each other, one ruling the stage, the other ruling the broadcast. When the cameras went live, James Brown delivered exactly what people expected from him. Explosive footwork, flawless control of the band, a stage presence that swallowed the room whole. But as the performance neared its designated end, something shifted. In the wings stage, managers did their job. They flashed the standard signals. The countdown began. The director waited for the moment when Brown would bring the song home. James Brown ignored all of it. Instead of wrapping up, he turned toward his band and gave a clear signal to keep going. It was not a mistake. It was a decision. The band, loyal and trained to follow him without hesitation, obeyed immediately. The music surged forward, blowing past the time limit as if it didn't exist. In the control room, producers felt the floor drop out. This wasn't just a long performance. This was James Brown seizing control of the show in real time. According to crew members, Cornelius ordered the director to cut the performance. The director hesitated. Cutting away from James Brown mid-song risked confusing viewers, angering fans, and possibly humiliating the show if word got out that they had cut off a legend. On stage, James Brown kept dancing, spinning, and dropping to his knees, a trademark collapse, followed by a dramatic recovery. Every move signaled the same message: not yet, not done, not finished because someone behind a camera said so. Witnesses later described the moment as a power play. It wasn't chaotic. It was precise. When the song finally ended and the cameras cut away, Cornelius moved fast. What happened next wasn't recorded, but fragments of the confrontation have circulated through backstage stories for decades. Several witnesses claimed Cornelius confronted Brown almost immediately, accusing him of ignoring production cues and disrespecting the show's structure in front of a national audience. James Brown did not apologize. According to one musician who claimed to be present, Brown snapped back that nobody cuts off James Brown and that Soul Train should be grateful for the moment he had just given them. Voices rose. People around them stopped talking, stopped moving, and simply watched. One dancer later recalled the room going dead silent as the two men argued, Cornelius standing for the system that gave black music a foothold on American television, Brown standing for raw, unfiltered dominance. Brown allegedly insisted he had earned the right to run his stage his way. Cornelius replied that no artist, no matter how legendary, would ever be allowed to be bigger than the show. The argument ended without apology, without agreement, without closure. But the real fallout didn't happen in that room. It happened afterward. James Brown was never publicly banned from Soul Train. No interviews framed it as a feud. No episode was advertised as his last appearance. Instead, something more subtle took place. Invitations simply stopped coming. Younger, more compliant artists cycled through the show season after season. James Brown's name, once treated like a crown jewel in the guest list, became rare, then disappeared completely. Industry insiders noticed the shift immediately. Rumors spread. Some claimed network executives had complained that Brown's overrun had disrupted ad blocks and thrown off the entire broadcast schedule. Others said Cornelius felt personally humiliated, not by the performance itself, but by the public display of defiance. A long-standing rumor claimed that afterward, Cornelius used the incident as a private warning. No artist would ever be allowed to hijack the show again. James Brown never publicly addressed what happened. He didn't need Soul Train to stay relevant. His legend kept growing. His influence remained intact. In terms of fame, he lost nothing. But he did lose something precise and powerful, a recurring presence on the most influential black music platform of that era. For Don Cornelius, the lesson came into sharp focus. Talent, even genius, could be celebrated, but authority that could never be challenged on live television. Inside Soul Train's walls that night in 1974 wasn't remembered just for the music. It was remembered as the moment James Brown proved in front of the nation that some legends refused to be controlled. Sly Stone, The Day Soul Train, caught a breakdown on camera, 1971. The third name, believed to permanently unsettle Don Cornelius, was Sly Stone. And the moment that changed everything did not happen in a tabloid headline. It happened in mid-1971 during a Soul Train taping in Los Angeles, at a time when the show was still fighting to prove it belonged on national television at all. This was not meant to be a comeback. It was supposed to be a victory lap. Sly Stone was one of the most important black artists in America. His appearance on Soul Train was designed to symbolize controlled progress and creative brilliance, a living example of what black music could be when it led the culture instead of chasing it. Instead, what unfolded on set exposed the one thing Don Cornelius feared more than controversy: loss of control caught on camera. According to former dancers and production staff, the trouble started before a single note was played. Sly arrived at the studio more than an hour late, forcing producers to hold rehearsal blocks and reshuffle the taping order. For a show built on precision timing, that alone was a serious problem. When he finally walked into the building, several crew members realized instantly that something was wrong. His speech was slow drifting. His answers came late, as if his thoughts were a few beats behind his mouth. One lighting technician later said, "Sly looked physically present, but mentally somewhere distant, like he was walking through fog." Don Cornelius was already on the floor, eyes on the production. He was informed personally that things were off schedule and off balance. For a man who treated timing as sacred, the warning hit a nerve. When the performance itself went live, the situation worsened. Sly stepped out under the lights and missed his opening cue. Band launched into the song, but he entered off beat. As the music continued, his vocals slipped in and out of sync, sometimes ahead of the rhythm, sometimes dragging behind. His body language was shaky. At one point, he leaned so heavily on the microphone stand that it looked less like a pose and more like a necessity. Camera operators tried to compensate, cutting to tight shots to hide how unstable the wider picture looked. But the wider shots couldn't be avoided forever. Dancers could be seen subtly shifting their positions, giving Sly more space, adjusting their movements just to avoid colliding with him. For viewers at home, the performance was merely uncomfortable, strange, uneven, not what they expected. For Don Cornelius, watching in real time, it was a nightmare. According to several backstage accounts, Cornelius was visibly angry before the segment even ended. In his mind, this was exactly the kind of moment Soul Train had been created to erase from the narrative images that could be used to portray black artists as undisciplined, unreliable, or out of control. Immediately after the performance, Cornelius reportedly moved toward Sly Stone backstage. The exchange that followed was short but loaded. Cornelius asked what had happened, asked if Sly was in any condition to be on national television that day. Sly's response, described by witnesses as scattered and dismissive, only deepened the damage. Rumors moved quickly through the corridors. Some staff members believed substance use had already begun to affect Sly's reliability. Others said Cornelius told trusted producers in private that Sly Stone could no longer be trusted on live TV. Not as a symbol, not as an anchor. What no one disputes is what came next. Sly Stone was never attacked in public. Soul Train did not make him an example in interviews. There were no headlines filled with accusations. Instead, a pattern emerged. Invitations slowed, then stopped. By the mid-1970s, Sly Stone had disappeared from the show completely. For Don Cornelius, that 1971 taping became a reference point. He never forgot the day he decided that genius without control was not an asset but a liability. And once he made that judgment, there was no going back. 4. George Clinton, when Funkadelic became too dangerous for television, 1978. By 1978, Soul Train was more than a cultural landmark. It was an economic machine tied to sponsors and contracts and the expectations of network television. That was the environment George Clinton and Funkadelic walked into and disrupted almost instantly. Their clash with Don Cornelius didn't start when the red light came on. It started in the rehearsal phase in the Soul Train studio in Los Angeles, when producers got their first look at what Clinton intended to bring to daytime television. According to multiple production accounts, Funkadelic arrived like a controlled explosion. Elaborate costumes, neon colors, outrageous silhouettes, and staged movement that leaned into psychedelic imagery. Nothing about it was subtle. Clinton's vision was deliberate theatrical chaos. During rehearsal, the band moved in ways that made no sense to television producers. Gestures and symbols that didn't follow a clear broadcast-friendly narrative. Dancers and musicians weaving through each other in patterns that seemed designed to confuse anyone trying to pin them down. Cornelius watched from the control area, growing increasingly uneasy. He had built Soul Train on rhythm structure and predictability, dancers moving in clean lines, artists hitting their marks, the show flowing like a smooth, controlled stream. Funkadelic didn't just resist that structure. They mocked it. They turned the frame into something wild. Producers tried to intervene. They asked Clinton to simplify the visuals, to tone down some of the gestures to make the performance easier for families and sponsors to absorb. Clinton refused. One assistant director later recalled Clinton saying, "If you clean it up, it's not Funkadelic." That response set off a chain reaction. Cornelius believed that once the cameras were live, there would be no way to explain or contain what viewers would see. During camera tests, those fears were confirmed. The imagery looked crowded and intense. The movement felt aggressive and unpredictable. According to one crew member, Cornelius used a single word to describe what he was seeing: uncontainable. Behind the scenes, there were also rumors that network representatives raised concerns after getting a look at rehearsal footage. Some warned that sponsors might pull out if the show aired something that looked too chaotic, too strange, too far removed from the clean upbeat image Soul Train had been selling for years. The response was calculated. Funkadelic was not formally banned, not dragged in the press, and not turned into a public enemy. Instead, they were quietly moved out of the show's future. Bookings were delayed, then quietly dropped. While George Clinton and Funkadelic built empires elsewhere, on stage, on records, inside a raw, devoted fanbase, Soul Train kept its distance. For Don Cornelius, Funkadelic represented a different kind of threat than Rick James or Sly Stone. They weren't chaotic by accident. They were chaotic on purpose. They weren't simply slipping out of control. They were rejecting control itself as part of the act. And on live television, that was the one thing he could not allow. Prince the star Don Cornelius could never control 1981. By 1980, Soul Train was no longer just a music and dance program. It had evolved into a carefully managed image machine, and Don Cornelius was its architect-in-chief. He had survived the volatility of the 1970s by enforcing strict, mostly unwritten rules about how black artists would appear on national television. Then Prince Rogers Nelson walked into Los Angeles, and those rules started to shake. Prince's early appearances and proposed bookings between 1980 and 1981 came during a highly volatile window. He was still years away from Purple Rain and global superstardom, but the danger was already visible. He was young, unpredictable, and unlike anything Soul Train had ever placed under its lights. According to former production staff, the tension began before Prince even hit the stage. His clothing alone was enough to set off alarms. He showed up in high heels, lace thigh-high boots, eyeliner and silhouettes that blurred conventional gender lines in ways daytime television wasn't built to handle. Crew members reportedly whispered that Prince looked less like a guest and more like a provocation. Don Cornelius watched all of this closely. Insiders remember him asking more than once whether Prince truly understood the show's audience, families, churchgoers, elders who believed Soul Train represented the good side of black culture. Prince's image in Cornelius's mind seemed designed to unsettle them, instead of reassure them. When Prince finally performed, the unease only deepened. His movements weren't chaotic like a Rick James explosion. They were slow, controlled, and intensely sensual. He didn't bounce to the rhythm the way most Soul Train guests did. He glided through it, turning the stage into something smaller, more private. He held the camera's gaze for long stretches, eyes lowered, lips biting gestures, landing closer to intimacy than performance. Dancers later said the room felt tense, not wild, not out of control, just still, like everyone was waiting for someone to step in and no one did. Prince wasn't breaking the rules loudly. He was bending them in silence. Cornelius did not shut down the performance. He didn't interrupt the taping or lecture anyone on camera. Instead, according to longtime staff, he shifted into a different mode. Prince became something the show had never dealt with before, a long-term risk that had to be watched, managed, contained. One former assistant producer later claimed Cornelius said privately that Prince was too hard to explain to Middle America. Another rumor suggested Cornelius was afraid Prince's image would confuse audiences already uneasy about changing ideas of black masculinity and gender presentation. Backstage, the divide sharpened. Prince reportedly refused to adjust his look or his performance style for the show. When asked quietly, professionally, to tone down certain gestures or moderate the sensual energy, he answered that his art couldn't be edited without being broken. Unlike Rick James, he didn't shout. He didn't insult the show. He didn't bargain. He simply did not comply. Cornelius's response was calculated. There would be no loud clash, no public fallout to feed gossip. Prince was not officially banned. That would have created headlines, questions, and pressure to explain. Instead, opportunities narrowed. The invites became less frequent. The excitement around his bookings cooled. Prince was never positioned as one of the show's core stars, even as his talent and impact became impossible to deny. Behind the scenes, it was rumored that Cornelius believed Prince did not present the kind of traditional black male image sponsors and networks felt comfortable backing during daytime hours. His androgyny, his sexuality, his refusal to explain himself, these elements made him unpredictable in a space built on predictability. Then something happened that Don Cornelius could not control. Prince stopped needing Soul Train. By 1982 and 1983, Prince's audience had outgrown the boundaries of any one television show. MTV radio and global tours became his primary engines. He bypassed the old gatekeeping routes that had once dictated who became a star and who stayed regional. His audience didn't ask permission. They followed him. As Prince ascended into worldwide icon status, Soul Train watched from a distance. Insiders would later describe the situation as a missed opportunity, one that some believed Cornelius privately regretted, but never acknowledged publicly. The reality was hard to escape. Prince had slipped through his hands, not because of a loud rebellion, but because of quiet independence. In the end, Prince wasn't hated in the traditional sense. Don Cornelius